And we'll take more questions on that, but I want to get to the probation matter, and it's just a slight update. Last week we came before you and talked about the problems with the probation system, and we offered two suggestions having to do with supervision of convicted criminals that we felt would help improve the situation. One was a bill that has been introduced in the Senate. I'm hopeful that a similar bill will be introduced in the House that would allow any sworn law enforcement officer to conduct warrantless searches of people who are on supervised probation. And the other had to do with the state website that would publicize those lost probationers. At that time, I indicated we had checked with the Division of Community Corrections and asked whether or not they could tell us how many were lost as of right now. And we did get word back later on Tuesday that there were 14,003 that were lost last week. We checked again yesterday, and we found that as of yesterday there were 13,986. So I'm proud to say that the state of North Carolina has found 17 of these lost probationers. Now, I don't know whether or not the way they found them was by searching obituaries and finding out that some of these folks have died, or whether or not they actually caught them and served them with papers for their failure to report. I call again on the governor, call again on the Division of Community Corrections, I call again on the Attorney General to support further efforts to deal with this crisis in our criminal justice system. Other questions?
Ms. Sparta.
President Obama is going to be signing the stimulus package today, and I'm sure many of you have had a little chance to look through some of the specifics. We've talked about some of the negatives. Do you see anything positive in that bill that could help North Carolina?
I've thought of how I would explain this to my grandsons, of which I have 4. Why I'm borrowing from them to help our economy today. And one thing that makes sense is to borrow for projects that will be serving them when they're older. So I think some of the capital money for capital projects that will be enjoyed in the future makes some sense. And there may be some other smaller items, but as a whole, it's bloated, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would agree with Skip's thoughts there. There are some real needs that we have in infrastructure, and I really do think that to a certain extent what we've seen here is a bait and switch on the part of the people at the federal level. All of the talk about stimulus early on was shovel-ready projects, infrastructure, building roads, building bridges, repairing roads and bridges, doing water and sewer systems. But what we see is a bill that, to the extent folks have read it, the amount of those kinds of projects in that bill is minuscule, and so what we've got is a situation where the sale pitch was you're going to get this, but when you actually see what you've brought home, you've got something completely different. In fact, I think if this was something in the Consumer Affairs Division, the Attorney General's office would investigate the federal government for the bait and switch aspects of this.
Even the tax cuts are temporary and just one-time rebates. Well, a person can't count on that in the next period. If these were permanent rate cuts that you could count on, then that would spur economic activity. But even that's misshapen.
The other thing that
Yeah. Go ahead.
we didn't think we were going to say anything about it. The other thing that it seems to me that we will see over time is how this bill really represents an unraveling of welfare reform. That the big success of the 1990s as far as government was concerned, we all remember Bill Clinton saying that the era of big government is over. But the big success there was the idea that in order to receive something from the government, there had to be a work component associated with it. And what we're seeing in this bill is just a huge transfer of wealth from those who produce and those who pay to those who do not produce and those who do not pay.
The governor is gathering some people to talk about how to distribute that money in North Carolina? Have any of you been approached, and if not, what is your suggestions on how to distribute this money?
I'll nominate Phil, he'll nominate me, but that's one thing that Democratic politicians are good at is gathering panels to decide how to spend other people's money.
What's your advice? What's your advice for how to spend it?
Well, it has to be spent obviously lawfully within the categories that are given. And when they get to infrastructure, they talk about shovel-ready. Let's talk about things that are ready to go. But more importantly, projects that, if we didn't have a crisis, would still be a good project. In other words, there is no economic benefit to digging a hole over here and filling it in over there and refilling the other way, or breaking all the windows just so you can create jobs by repairing windows. Let's make sure these projects are viable on their own terms.
Bill, another thing.
A report we had this morning during a caucus meeting was that about 45% of the stimulus packages are actually tax cuts. The negative part to North Carolina is we follow the IRS code. And by doing so, this is an exacerbation of our, what would be a shortfall already. So what we may gain on one side, we're going to lose on the other, and it may be a wash or it may be a loss. But the reality is it's not going to stimulate us.
Other questions?
Yeah, on one of the, did you want to call something?
No, yes, go ahead, then we'll get you.
One of the other parts of the stimulus package is efforts to stimulate alternative energy. And there are a few thousand jobs in North Carolina. There are some things the state can do to further encourage those jobs, which include manufacturing jobs. I'm curious if there is a philosophical sense about whether those are things the state ought to do. There's manufacturing tax cuts, there's personal income tax cuts, there's more specifically a cap on guaranteed energy savings contracts the state can enter.
The best thing you can do for economic development is to lower the marginal tax rate permanently. These targeted things are interesting, but ultimately are self-defeating. I'll give you an example. 28 years ago, I received my first credit for solar heating. We were told, 30 years ago that if we did that for just a few years, that soon that would be self-supporting. And it's still not. And the reason it's not is because it doesn't make economic sense. That's the problem with targeted tax credits.
Would you say that same thing is true about the general business incentives programs that the state has, that they are essentially targeted tax credits?
Well, my personal opinion is yes. That's not necessarily a caucus position, but I think they have failed demonstrably.